Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You are watching and listening to Historian Radio's Echoes of the News, and I am Muhammad Hussain Qazi, and these are today's headlines from the past. On this day, the 29th of November in 1864, it would be a dark day in the history of the United States of America. It would be on this day that several hundred Cheyenne and some Arapaho Indians who had surrendered to the United States had been given permission to camp at Sand Creek in the Colorado Territory while negotiating a peace formula. Their chief, Black Kettle, had agreed to the disarming of their troops. However, Colonel John M. Chivington, with 1,200 troops, mounted a surprise attack on the peaceful Cheyenne Arapaho people. And in such, the troops would unfortunately kill around 400 men, women, and children, and it would therefore trigger the Cheyenne Arapaho War. Truly, this would be one of the darkest days in the history of the United States of America. This day, the 29th of November, 1864. Continuing on this date, in 1929, the 29th of November 1929, American Admiral Richard Byrd became the first man to fly over the South Pole with his pilot, Burnt Bolton. A fascinating day in the history of aviation and travel. And finally, the day 29th of November 1945 would have been celebrated as the National Day of the Federal People's Socialist Republic of Yugoslavia, which would be its national day commemorating its formation as a socialist republic that had liberated itself from the Third Reich, and of course, its victory in the Second World War over the Third Reich. The country would come together under the rule of Marshal Josip Broz Tito, who would rule the country until his death in the 1980s. He remains to be one of the most interesting figures in the history of Cold War politics and Yugoslavia. Unfortunately, today, Yugoslavia no longer exists as it collapsed in 1991, followed by a series of long and painful wars. But in its day, Yugoslavia was one of the most powerful nations in Eastern Europe. And so, its National Day would be one of the most historic dates in the history of the 20th centuries and in the history of the Cold War. And now we move on to the next segment of our show, after concluding today's headlines, which is where we recount the famous births and deaths of famous figures from the 19th and 20th centuries and sometimes earlier. Born on this day in 1932 was Jacques Chirac, famous French politician who would serve as Prime Minister of the country and head of state. And so Jacques Chirac was also an interesting figure in the history of contemporary French politics. And on this day, in 1780, Maria Theresa, Empress of Austria and Queen of Hungary and Bohemia, who renewed Austria's power and authority, passed away. On this day, in 1780, her death is mourned by all those who marvel at the glory days of the Age of Enlightenment, particularly so the Age of Enlightenment in Austrian politics. And on that note, we conclude today's headlines of the day. You are watching and listening to Historian Radio's Echoes of the News, and I am Muhammad Hussain Qazi, and these were today's headlines as history first heard them. Please check out our other series, Historian Radio's Defense Review and Crossroads, both of whom shall be returning to you soon this week with more interesting topics from the sphere of current affairs and the world of defense. That was it for today's headlines. Good night.